We grew up pretty quickly. I had my first birthday party when I was 23 years old. I'd never celebrate my birthday before that.
Janet Jackson has finally broken her silence, and the world is still talking. For years, she kept her thoughts locked away, letting rumors and headlines speak louder than her own voice.
Not knowing what my life, how it would turn out, because I would love to experience.
Now, her words expose struggles, secrets, and truths no one ever expected to hear. What forced her to finally step forward? What hidden pain has she carried in silence for so long? And why has her revelation left so many shaken? The answers aren't simple, and they're nothing like you'd imagine. Roots, room, and rhythm. Home was small, loud, and full of music. Gary, Indiana, gave the Jacksons a 2-bedroom house and a big dream.
The 7th child of Joe and Catherine, in Gary, Indiana.
10 children tried to sleep, study, and sing under one roof on Jackson Street. The steel mills roared, trains rattled past, and inside that house, a different sound rose. Piano notes, hand claps, and harmonies that cut through the noise of a working-class city. Catherine played piano and loved hymns and country tunes. She carried faith and calm, teaching patience and pitch at the same time. Joe worked long shifts as a crane operator, then picked up his guitar at night. He believed practice made winners, and that mistakes carried a cost. Crowded rooms made privacy rare, but togetherness became training. Dinners turned into call and response. Chores carried a tempo. Older siblings coached the younger ones. Michael, the 8th child, heard rhythm everywhere. Pots on the stove, shoes on the floor, rain on the windows. He copied what he heard, then twisted it into something new. He sang to himself, tapped beats on tables, danced before mirrors. Even before he knew why, he felt safe inside a groove. Stories of the house at night still linger. A living room cleared for practice, clapping in time. Joe's sharp ear catching every slip. When Tito secretly strummed Joe's guitar and broke a string, fear filled the room, until Joe ordered him to play. Tito strummed again, and the mistake became a doorway. If one child held rhythm like this, what could all of them do together? A family band stopped being a fantasy and became a plan. Gary shaped that plan. Churches gave the kids gospel fire. Local radio poured out blues and R&B. On weekends, talent shows and clubs opened their doors to brave performers. The Jackson brothers learned more than songs. They learned to command a stage. Matching outfits, tight choreography, harmonies that felt bigger than their small bodies, these became their tools. Michael studied his brother's moves, then topped them with a spin, a shout, or perfectly timed silence. He was the youngest, but he led with feel. Discipline ruled the day. First came homework, then rehearsal. Rehearsal followed by more rehearsal. Joe was like an army sergeant. The kids drilled fundamentals, breathing, timing, blending, acting like pros, despite their very juvenile age. Catherine balanced things out by doing things like checking their homework, packing lunches, and softening the sharp edges whenever she could. Together, the parents built a system that was a mixture of love and pressure. It offered the kids a well-defined road, but often took away their recuperation. Michael's early shows already bore the marks of the man he was to become, cutting voice through noise, feet stomping squarely on time, charisma way beyond his years. The band became tighter. The brothers learned to read the crowd, to stretch a chorus, to make a quiet verse feel like a secret. They entered contests, won trophies, and built a name on the local circuit. The victories brought bigger stages, longer rehearsals, and stiffer competition. Success also brought change. More noise, schoolwork, sibling squabbles, and strangers who now knew their names. A few coins for a show turned into a bit of money, well spent on booking. Childhood was shrinking, while the dream grew. Michael proudly felt, perhaps, but had a wariness, for there was applause, less play. Staying together, even as one, they were siblings. With each other, they stood on each other's shoulders. covered up their mistakes, helped to soak in the spotlight, and took turns bearing the burden. This sound they made is no accident. It is born from cramped rooms, tight harmonies, and born from the belief that music could open a door out of Gary. That door would soon be opened. Talent shows raised them from small stages to bigger venues. Bigger venues drew attention from outside. A producer's business card here, a whisper of Mottown there. The air of the house shifted. Practice was no longer abstract. It tasted of purpose. The next step would test all that they had constructed, their sound, their ties, and their balance as a family facing a fast, hungry business. And once the phone calls started and the suits showed up at the door, the ascent began, turning that cramped living room rhythm into a national sound and planting the first seeds of the space that would grow between two rising stars. Ascent and the space between. The leap from Gary's living room to the lights of Mottown came fast. One moment, the Jackson brothers were winning talent shows. The next, they were auditioning for Berry Gordy, the man who turned raw talent into stars. Mottown polished them, packaged them, and sent them out as the Jackson Five. 5 boys in matching suits, moving as one, led by the smallest voice with the biggest reach. I Want You Back shot to number 1.
Baby, baby, I want you back.
Then came ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. 4 consecutive chart toppers announced a revolution. A family band had become a phenomenon. Michael was barely into his teens when strangers screamed his name in airports and fainted at concerts. The Jackson Five toured relentlessly, a blur of buses, planes, and hotels. Crowds pressed against barriers just to glimpse them. The joy was real, but so was the grind. Childhood games were replaced with choreography. Report cards mattered less than rehearsals. Though close on stage, the industry pulled at each member in different ways. Janet, still very young, watched from home. She saw brothers vanish for weeks, returning with stories of cities she'd never seen. To her, Michael was both a sibling and a figure on TV, larger than life. She admired his energy, but noticed the toll. His voice had to be flawless, his moves sharp, his interviews charming, no matter how tired he was. He was learning to be a star before he'd learned to simply be a teenager. As the 1970s closed, Michael stepped out further. Off the Wall in 1979 revealed what he could do alone. Slick disco grooves, heartfelt ballads, and independence that set him apart. Critics praised him. Fans adored him. And suddenly, the youngest brother was becoming the family's driving force. When Thriller landed in 1982, the divide widened. The album shattered records. Music videos became events, and Michael's fame eclipsed nearly everything else. Janet was discovering her own career path, acting, music, and finally, her own voice. Michael was in her life, but their worlds had shifted. Those who once practiced together now had different managers, busy schedules, and worlds apart. Michael was surrounded by advisors, bodyguards, and producers. The kinds of conversations that used to happen around the family dinner table are now passed through assistants. With all the wealth that fame affords, it also builds walls between family members who were once so attuned to each other. Though there was a tie, it was frayed at the edges. Because of success, Michael had to isolate himself. His movements were now limited for safety reasons. A rare thawing of privacy occurred. Janet was also witnessing her brother's transformation in heart, but in accessibility. He became less or more closely guarded. Each gesture was noted, each word dissected by tabloids. For someone who grew up desiring such applause, this adulation became a form of feeding and fettering. Her career began to gain momentum in the mid-1980s. She took the world by storm with Control in 1986, marking her entry into the arena as a true force. For the first time, she was not merely Michael's sister, but an artist with her own identity. Though her fans rejoiced at her independence, she mourned privately for the days when family ties seemed simple. Janet would later share how their career success led to fewer phone conversations and far less time together. There were still glimpses of affection. They made an effort to attend each other's projects, cracked jokes when their schedules allowed, and remembered the life they once had forged together in Gary. But fame was merciless. It not only uplifts them, but it also becomes the source of their segmentation. Their rise to fame was meteoric, yet with it came distance, an unavoidable chasm created by the success itself. The distances between them would only become more pronounced when scandal struck. Suddenly, the world's gaze turned sharper, the questions harsher, and the pressure heavier. And in that moment, Janet would discover that being Michael's sister meant not only sharing in the glory, but also bearing the weight of the storm that was about to fall. Shockwaves and collateral. The 1990s began with Michael at the height of his powers.
Michael Jackson was a pop genius, selling 750 million albums.
He had conquered music, reinvented the video, and become the most recognizable entertainer on Earth. But in 1993, a story broke that shifted the world's gaze from his art to his private life. Allegations of child indecent abuse surfaced, first whispered in tabloids, then shouted in headlines. A 13-year-old boy and his father accused Michael of acts he firmly denied. Investigations followed, his home was searched, and suddenly, the king of pop stood not just as a performer, but as a defendant in the court of public opinion. For Janet, the shock was personal. She knew her brother as family long before the cameras. To see his name tied to such charges was painful and bewildering. She also understood how quickly the media could turn. Overnight, adoration became suspicion. No one seemed to remember the years of music and charity. They wanted scandal. For the Jacksons, the noise was overwhelming. Michael maintained his innocence, insisting the claims were false and driven by money. The legal process moved slowly, but the damage spread quickly. Tabloids churned out daily stories, blending fact and rumor. Images of police raids at Neverland Ranch flashed worldwide. Michael's silence, broken only by carefully worded statements, deepened the mystery. Even though no criminal charges were filed due to insufficient evidence, the reported multi-million-dollar settlement was seen by many as guilt, despite his insistence that it was to end the chaos. The collateral damage went beyond Michael. Janet was soaring in her own career, preparing for tours and endorsements. Suddenly, the family name was under siege. Companies grew nervous. One of her biggest deals, a Coca-Cola endorsement, disappeared almost overnight. She felt the cancellation very much, not earnestly for the lost opportunity, but in her heart, she felt the punishment for the accusations she had never been involved in. In 2 words, her career was soiled by association. Family bond had been assessed. In public, the Jacksons were holding firmly to Michael while reminding the world about his kindness. In private, they were grappling with the hard times that the allegations placed on their family because every topic became a conversation on the scandal. Friends became apprehensive, colleagues became interfering, and trust, always free in its exercise, began to deteriorate in the realm of suspicion. For Janet, resilience equals survival. So much work went into performing her frustration through song and dance. The themes of her songs, independence and strength, served, in a way, as an answer to doubters. Yet the sting remains. She later confessed that the scandal changed the way people looked at her family. Doors shutting in their faces for no reason, and innocence being swallowed by suspicion. Suspicion never proved. Fans were divided, with some defending Michael fiercely and calling the allegations mere opportunism, while others turned away, not settled by the surrounding uncertainty. That divide still existed long after the case was settled, becoming more difficult, since Michael was increasingly trapped in health damage, dependence on painkillers, and growing stress. His once boundless energy dimmed as he continued to battle for performance. One lesson Janet had learned: success is shaky. A cover story could dismantle much. Any scandal, whether true or not, could alter much. She saw her brother shrinking into a smaller circle, with fewer people to trust, living much more carefully. She shivered at this, remembering that fame was, after all, not a cloak but a spotlight, revealing every shadow. These accusations served to mark a turning point in both the siblings' lives. The innocence of the Motown years and the joy of an eventual global success have turned into something harsher. The realization that the higher you climb, the more severe the fall when the world begins to doubt you. And yet, out of that darkness, the siblings tried to reclaim control, not with press conferences or lawyers, but with music. Together, they would create a single defiant anthem, a chance to face the world not in silence, but in unison. One song, two worlds. When the storm around Michael's life threatened to swallow everything, music became his weapon. In 1995, he turned to the one person who knew both the boy in Gary and the man on the stage, his sister, Janet. The result was Scream, a song born out of anger, defiance, and a shared need to fight back. It wasn't just another duet. It was a statement to the world that the Jacksons were still here, still united, and still willing to raise their voices above the noise. The track itself carried fire. Michael's verses seethed with frustration at tabloids, lawsuits, and endless scrutiny.
New explosive allegations have been made by two men, claims they were abused as children and their families exploited in the worst possible way.
Janet matched his energy with sharp, unapologetic lines of her own. Their voices intertwined, sometimes clashing, blending, but always pushing against the same invisible wall. The beat was futuristic, the production slick, and the message unmistakable. Enough was enough. Fans and critics alike recognized it as more than just music. It was resistance on wax. Then came the video. With a record-setting budget, Scream was a spectacle. Spaceships, black and white visuals, sharp choreography. The imagery made headlines before the song even hit the charts. On screen, the siblings moved in perfect sync, their bodies snapping through routines that felt both playful and aggressive. Michael and Janet leaned on one another, literally and artistically, and it seemed to the outside world like a moment of healing. For a brief time, the Jacksons had reclaimed their narrative, but behind the camera, cracks were still present. Janet later admitted that filming was not the easy reunion fans imagined. She felt sidelined by Michael's team, kept waiting for hours while decisions were made without her input. The tension wasn't with Michael himself. She still loved and admired him.
To honor the man I love and admire as an artist and a person, my brother, Michael Jackson.
But with the machinery around him, fame had built walls even between siblings, and Janet felt the sting of being treated as secondary in a project that was supposed to symbolize unity. Closeness with a touch of distance defined their interaction. On set, there was laughter and joking between takes that casually slipped into the comfort of childhood reminiscences. But off the set, they were pulled apart again by schedules and entourage. Janet later expressed that she wished they had had more time together back then, sharing more authentic moments off the radar. The video appeared reconciliatory. The emotions were all the more complicated. Still, Scream had its effects. It became a rallying cry for fans who felt attacked, judged, or misunderstood. For Michael, it was a way to take all that rage and throw it into art. For Janet, it was an opportunity to stand with her brother when the world seemed bent on tearing him apart. Despite the many frustrations that accompanied the project, she never regretted voicing her support in his fight. It was important, she said later. It had to be said, and it had to be said together. The hit song and the award-winning video itself seemed together for a moment in an attempt at fraternal defiance, while actually not obscuring deeper faults. Michael's life would be eternally scrutinized. Janet was still working in her profession under the burden of what the family name signified. Scream was a battle cry, but it could end no wars. In retrospect, Scream perfectly epitomizes that rare juncture where the most distant global star and all the shrillest distance between personal pain and public pressure fall. No other project could capture the extremes of that bond, anger, and artistry quite as well. For fans, it also served to verify that, despite the differences brought on by fame and circumstance, Michael and Janet could still move to the beat of one drum, but not even music could shield them from what came next. 14 years later, a phone call shattered Janet's world with news so devastating that she nearly collapsed behind the wheel. The storm was only beginning. Loss, questions, and the quiet. The summer of 2009 began like any other for Janet Jackson. She was preparing for projects, balancing her career with cautious optimism. But all of that ended on June 25th. The call came suddenly, a scream on the other end. "He's dead!" Janet nearly lost control of her car when she heard the words. Her legs gave out. Her body crumpled under the weight of disbelief. Michael, her brother, her childhood partner, her rival, her friend, was gone at only 50. The world plunged into grief. Vigils appeared from Los Angeles to Tokyo. News anchors replayed old videos.
Michael Jackson suffered cardiac arrest this afternoon.
And millions mourned the man they believed would never leave the stage. For Janet, the loss was private and raw. She described driving through the city, begging strangers to help her because she couldn't stand. It wasn't the global icon she cried for, it was Mike, the brother who teased her, who shared songs with her first. Grief did not come alone. Almost immediately, questions surfaced. The cause of death, an overdose of propofol, a hospital anesthetic, did not sound accidental. Why had it been used as a sleep aid in a private home? Who was responsible for giving it? And had Michael been warning all along that someone wanted him gone? His children, his sisters, even Janet herself hinted at suspicions beyond medical negligence. Janet struggled with those whispers. She wanted to honor her brother quietly, yet she could not ignore the inconsistencies, the strange business dealings, the people who did not always have his best interests at heart. She, like the rest of her family, wondered if Michael had been failed not only by medicine, but by a system eager to exploit him until his last breath. In public, she maintained her dignified posture.
It's hard to choose friends. You don't know if they're being your friend because you're...
At the BET Awards, just a few days following his demise, she stood before the crowd to express her gratitude for their affection. The message was short and shaky in voice, but her presence alone told the world that Michael was more than a star. He was a brother and deeply loved.
So many brothers and sisters, and we had one another. We really didn't have too many outside friends because we were so busy working. We were our best friends.
Outside the public display, she immersed herself in memorial services, comforting nieces and nephews and holding on to a shaken heart. But behind this composure, she withdrew. Janet would later admit she had closed herself off to deal with grief alone. With some passing moments in Paris, Janet was just walking without watching Michael's videos in the dead of night as tears fell on her pillow. Some days your memory makes her smile. Some days it breaks her. "He's in my thoughts daily," she said, always. This kind of quiet was not peace. It was survival. The questions lingered on. Was it a catastrophic accident? Or was it something of a much darker shade? Janet would never know. All she knew was that Michael left a hole that could not be filled. He was the man who stood by her on that stage, pushed her to sing louder, dance harder, dream bigger. But now he was only a memory. And memories, no matter how bright and vivid, don't hold the hand when that grief has become unbearable. But Janet's story never ended in silence. Out of that quiet came a voice hers, stronger, sharper, unafraid to break through the shadows. What she would reveal in the years ahead would shock even those who thought they knew everything about the Jacksons. What she says now: time has a way of softening edges, but it never erases the deepest cuts. For Janet Jackson, reaching 58 has meant looking back at a life carved by triumphs, losses, and secrets that were once too heavy to share. Today, she speaks with a clarity that only comes from surviving storms, and the world has been stunned by the truths she has finally allowed herself to voice. When Janet reflects on her family, she doesn't hide the complexity anymore. She talks openly about how growing up in the Jackson household was both a blessing and a burden. The music gave them purpose, but it also robbed them of normal childhoods. She recalls the discipline of her father Joe, the laughter of her siblings, and the constant reminder that the world expected perfection. At 58, Janet no longer sugarcoats it. It wasn't always easy. We carried pain alongside the success. That admission, raw and unfiltered, has startled fans who once saw only polished performances. Her bond with Michael is the part she speaks of most carefully. She still honors his genius, still lights up when recalling their early closeness, but she doesn't avoid the darker truth that fame created a wedge, that allegations and scandals isolated him, and that sometimes she felt powerless to reach him. "We were inseparable once," she admitted, "but fame, it builds walls." Even now, her voice carries the ache of someone who lost a brother long before he actually died. At 58, Janet admits that the grief hasn't gone away. It has simply become part of who she is. In addition, she has expressed her feelings on the controversies surrounding Michael's name. While not defending all of his choices, Janet insists on one thing: his humanity. "People forget he was human," she said. "He felt pain, he had fears, and he loved deeply." That reminds us that this was a man, her brother, whose narrative was never merely the sum of allegations and accusations. But perhaps the most shocking part of Janet's recent revelations is how she is turning that lens back on herself. She had been quieter for years, the Jackson who would let the music do most of the talking. Now she is ready to talk about her own struggles with body image, self-worth, and being overshadowed. She talked about how her older brother's taunts about her weight in childhood stuck with her, creating insecurities that would come to haunt her into adulthood. Fans who once saw her as untouchable are stunned at this new, frank talk. At 58, she is tired of hiding. Janet speaks of legacy, not just Michael's, but her own. She knows that there are still people who convey her story in relation to her brother, but she is intent on reminding them of Janet's individuality. "I am my own person," she says, "and I want to be remembered for what I gave, not just who I stood beside." This stands in defiance, particularly as she continues to perform, create, and inspire a new group of artists. Those revelations have shaken fans to their foundation as they strip down the myth. Now we see Janet, the sister, the daughter, the woman who experienced loss, yet found the strength to hold it all together. At 58, Janet feels no obligation to tiptoe around the truth anymore. Where she once had a carefully measured tone, now there is strength behind her voice. But even as she reclaims her story, one question lingers. What did Janet reveal about Michael's death that still leaves the world unsettled? The final chapter holds the most haunting truth of all: legacy, boundaries, and grace. As Janet Jackson steps into her late 50s, her voice carries the weight of survival, experience, and hard-earned wisdom. For decades, she lived in the shadow of her last name, one that symbolized both brilliance and controversy. Now she is finally defining what her legacy means, not as Michael's sister, not as Joe Jackson's daughter, but as Janet, an artist, a survivor, and a woman who has chosen grace in a world that often gave her little of it. Janet has spoken candidly about boundaries, something she once struggled to enforce. Growing up in the Jackson family, personal limits were almost non-existent. Rehearsals took priority over childhood, and public scrutiny was inescapable. For years, she allowed her identity to be defined by others, critics, family expectations, even her own insecurities. At 58, she makes it clear, those days are over. She has learned the power of saying no, of protecting her peace, and of valuing herself outside of applause or headlines. Fans who once saw her as soft-spoken are now hearing a woman who knows her worth and refuses to compromise it. Yet Janet's journey is not about bitterness. Where others might carry resentment, she has chosen grace. She acknowledges the pain, Michael's loss.
We all remember where we were when we heard that Michael Jackson had died.
Her family's internal rifts, the scrutiny of the media, but she speaks of them without venom. "I don't want to live in anger," she has said. "It only steals from the joy that's still here." That refusal to sink into bitterness shocks many, given how much she has endured. But it's also what sets her apart. Janet has turned her scars into a quiet kind of strength. Her legacy now transcends music. Of course, she is one of the all-time great performers, having forged new paths in sound, choreography, and storytelling. But today, the very 58-year-old sees that impact in a wider light. Young women who aspire to her might cite her as a model of independence. Activists would refer to her persistence as a case of survival from exploitation. All that she has to offer, Janet, is not music, but the bravery to live authentically in a world that tried to script her life. And then there is Michael. He is still lingering in her words, in her reflection concerning family and fame. She eulogizes his brilliance, albeit mentioning the lessons his story has left behind, the risks from isolation and a price for fame without merit, along with the necessity to safeguard one's soul. Sharing those truths, Janet ensures that Michael's legacy endures not just through tragedy, but also as a reminder of what the industry can take if boundaries are not fiercely protected. To the world, it's startling for her to be so open in recent times. The soft-spoken woman who once bore her pain in silence has become a guiding light for others with her honesty. She is a voice of balance, acknowledging pain without being consumed by it, celebrating victory without denying the cost.
And with those men equally outraged by discrimination who support us in heart and mind.
That balance, that grace, is Janet at 58. Though broken, her silence does not speak of scandal. It speaks of survival, resilience, and dignity. And therein lies the shock, the calm, the grace in moving forward, not in rage and accusation. Her story serves as a reminder that legacy is not simply what you leave behind. It is how you live and what you do in the present. And Janet Jackson has chosen to walk with grace through hers despite everything. If this helped you hear Janet's voice more clearly, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Which part of her revelation moved you most? The bond, the distance, or the way she frames Michael's legacy today? Watch the next video on your screen for a deeper dive into your favorite Hollywood stars. Hollywood.